When I first started editing photos, I would look at my photos and I would look at photos of really talented professional photographers whose work I admired, and it wasn't even close. And what I learned over time as I've gotten further and further into editing is that they were controlling their photo way better than I was controlling my photo. And that's not just in camera, although of course that plays a part of it. But I'm talking about in post-processing, and I'm talking about the use of masking, because masking is about control. Masking is basically just painting certain edits into certain parts of the photo, because otherwise every slider you move impacts the entire photo. That doesn't really work on most photos. The way I think to get the best possible results is to use masking. And I'm in Lightroom today. I did a poll in a recent video and on my recent newsletter asking people what they would like me to cover in future Lightroom videos. And one of the key responses was, hey, I would like more information about the basics of masking. So this is that video. This video is a beginner's guide to masking. And despite the fact that I'm talking about a beginner's guide, I still think intermediate users would gain some things out of this, because there are a lot of powerful masking tools in Lightroom. I'm going to cover 7 tools in this video because there's a couple of others that I'm going to reserve for a different video, simply because they're a bit more advanced. Complicated, maybe, just more involved. They're not really hard, but they take more stuff to get your kind of arms around them. So we're going to cover 7 masking types in this video. They're powerful, and I'm going to include 2 files if you want to download them for free. These are available to my newsletter subscribers. So if you want these 2 files, you can download them by joining my newsletter at the link below. I'm going to have these 2 things. One is an actual photo, which is this photo, and the other one is this gray sheet, which is incredibly boring, but incredibly useful to demonstrate what masking is. And so we're going to start with that. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm not going to do any adjustments here with any of these tools. I'm going to go straight into masking in Lightroom, which is this little button here. If you hover, you'll see that it says masking. You click it and it opens up your menu. So in this video, we're going to cover subject, sky, background, object, brush, linear, and radial gradient. That's because those are the ones I use really frequently. The 2 that we're not going to cover are going to be color range and luminance range, simply because they take some more stuff, right? Those will be future videos. But I wanted to start by talking about brush mask, because that is really the kind of the first foray that most people will take into masking. And I want to point out, this is a beginner's guide, which means I'm not going to cover every single tip and trick, every single little key, stroke, or whatever that you can do. I'll share some of those for sure because they're useful, but I can't possibly in one video cover every single thing about every single aspect of masking. We would be here all day. You don't have time. I don't have it either, but you're going to get a lot out of this video, and it's going to be kind of long. So hang in there. When you open masking, and I chose brush mask, I've got this little masking menu here where it says create new mask. And you can see you've basically got 4 choices here. You've got size, which is how big is your paintbrush, right? Because remember, masking is painting. All you're doing is painting an edit into a part of the photo. You've got feathering. Feathering is, if you see the 2 circles here on, as I move size, there's 2 circles, an inner circle and an outer circle. Feathering is the distance between those. So if I go lower and lower feathering, you will see that distance collapses. And at 0 feather, that distance doesn't exist. It is essentially a single circle, whereas at 100, there's a greater distance. The reason this is important is because that distance, that area between the 2 circles, that's what I call the gradient zone. That is the zone in which your edit will fade. Inside that inner circle is 100% of your edit, and then it fades to 0. So that allows you to blend it into the photo more accurately, more smoothly is a better way of saying it. So I think feathering is incredibly important, and 90 probably something percent of the time I'm at a feathering of 100 because I want that smooth transition. I don't want it to be really obvious that I did something and then you have an abrupt stop and then you don't see whatever you did inside the circle, if you will. Now, flow is the rate of application. At 100, it applies whatever your effect is at 100% on a single brush stroke. But if you reduce the flow, it will build up to 100% with multiple strokes. And so that's the rate of application. And then density is the maximum amount of the effect, regardless of how many strokes you apply. So I usually use density at 100, which means whatever effect I'm applying is applying at 100%. But I can reduce density to, let's say, 50 or something like that. And in doing so, no matter how many strokes I make over an area, the most that effect is going to apply in that area is 50 because the density is 50. So it's a less dense application of the effect. So that's the difference between flow and density. So the first thing I want to do, and I use the right and left bracket key quite a bit. Left bracket key will make this smaller, right bracket key will make it larger. And what I want to do is drop the exposure to -4, which would make it completely black, except nothing happened, and that's because I'm in the masking menu. I've told it, hey, I want whatever I paint to be -4 on the exposure, but I haven't done anything yet. And that's where these brush strokes start coming in. As soon as I start painting, you can see I'm getting -4 there, and you can see that the edge, the transition area, which is the outside of this, kind of fades and dissipates. Whereas, to show you what feathering looks like, at feathering of 0, you can see it's a hard edge. And that's what I mean. It's an abrupt transition. So this allows you to go really smoothly. That's why I like feathering. It just gives you a smoother application, and it blends whatever this edit is into the rest of the photo. Now flow, I'll take flow down to 50, let's say, and you can see I go like that, and it doesn't get 100% of the effect. And so all it's going to do is require me to go over it and over it and over it until I eventually do build up to 100% of the effect. Now again, the edges are still hard. It's because feathering is at 0, so I can do the same thing, feathering back to 100, and I get that smooth. You can see it's a really gentle application because the flow is at 50. But as I paint over it and paint over it and paint over it, that flow increases, and eventually it will top out at 100% and give me that full effect. So that's a great way, if you're not sure how much you want to apply, to just kind of slowly build up to it. And then I'm just going to drop the density. Let's make the density 50 and put the flow back at 100. And so here, I'm going to take left bracket key. I'm going to go ahead and just draw this. And you can see that I'm going to go over this and over this and over it, but it's never going to get more than 50% of the effect. So that -4 exposure, despite me continuing to paint and paint and paint, it's never really going to reach -4. I've set a density of 50, which means it's really only going to reach a -2. That's a way to look at it. And again, just to change the feathering, just so you can see it with the hard edge, same kind of thing, right? So as I'm drawing this circle, you can see lagging on me here, kind of behind me, but no matter how many times I go over this and go over it and go over it, my density is at 50, it's never going to get the full effect of that -4 exposure. It's really just maxed out at -2. Now, a couple of other things to be aware of in this menu. You can click invert, and all I did is just flip what I did. And that comes in really handy when you mask something, and maybe you need the opposite of that. Maybe it's a smaller area to mask and you just want to use the rest of the photo. You can invert it. So I basically inverted the mask. But note that my density and flow and all that stuff are inverted as well. So just keep that in mind. I can go back to invert. And of course, there is an erase. So I can come over here with an erase and I can just erase these. And for some reason, if you have flow really low and you're erasing, you might be like, God, it's not erasing. What's going on? It's because your flow is too low, right? So raise that flow back to 100 to erase, and it just makes it much more rapid. So having done that, you can come in this right here, and I'm going to delete mask 1. It's going to be done with that. And I want to show you 2 other examples. The next one is a linear gradient. A linear gradient is just a line. So it opens up, and I can come in here and draw a line. And this is great for covering large areas like a foreground in a landscape. And you've got a number of controls here. Again, this is your gradient zone, these 2 areas between that upper line, if you will, and that lower line. So below that lower line, below that, 100% of the effect applies. And then it starts to fade all the way to eventually hitting a 0. And that's how you blend or fade your effect into the rest of the image. Now, if you go really tight, you've got a very narrow transition, so it's more abrupt. And in fact, let me scoot this up. This center section, you can move that all around just to make it higher or lower in the photo. You can also grab that center line and tilt it if you'd like to. You can also tilt with that if you want. So let's say I have it kind of tilted. I want to make it more of a gradient. But maybe if I start moving this down, I get like that, and my gradient is unnoticeable, right? So I come over here and I have a -4 exposure, but oh gosh, that's a terrible blend. I need to go back and I need to make that gradient bigger. Well, if you start grabbing this, you'll find that it's really difficult to grab and separate those lines. But if you do it over here, it's much easier, right? And also notice you can flip this either way and it'll just reverse the mask for you. I want the mask to go from the bottom up, so that's how I do that. Also note that you have an amount slider, which is basically like reducing the strength of the area that's kind of a little bit like flow or density, if you will, in that it's reducing the strength of the section that you've masked, because this is not the brush mask, the linear gradient, it just works different, right? So it doesn't have the flow and density, but the amount comes in handy there. And I believe it defaults to 100, and of course you can go higher if you want to, and there you go, you're getting the full effect. Now that I've done that, I'm going to delete that, I'm going to delete all masks, and I'm going to go get a radial gradient, another really powerful mask that I use a lot. And as you can see, it's basically a elliptical or semicircular kind of shape where you can make it a circle if you want, right? Kind of like that. But generally speaking, it's kind of an oval or egg, elliptical shape. And again, you've got various options here. You've got an inner circle, 100% of the effect applies there. And then it fades. This is your gradient zone again from that inner circle to the outer circle. Outside of this, you can tilt it if you'd like to. You can also do that with this little handle down here. You can just grab that. And if you want to change this gradient zone, you can do that. Just grab this, and that is making a much smaller transition zone. Whereas if you pull that back in, that's making it higher or a larger or a greater transition zone. Also notice over here, there's a feathering slider. So watch as I move this inner circle, it's at 70. Well, I'm increasing the feathering. Let me rephrase that. I'm increasing the size of the inner circle. So I'm decreasing the feathering. So you'll see the number is getting smaller. So it's a smaller transition zone. And going back the other way, shrinking this, you can see the number is going higher and higher and higher until it gets to 100, in which case I've just got a tiny little dot in the center and an incredibly high or smooth or broad transition zone. Again, creating a larger area that my effect can fade more gently into the rest of the photo. And then I can come over here and say exposure -4, and you can see what it looks like there. And if I want to change the feathering, eventually I'll get to it's just a hard edge around that egg shape that I've created. And that's because feathering's at 0. Again, I generally use feathering pretty high, but on radial gradients, I might adjust it some. Like on a brush, I'm usually at 100. On a radial gradient, I may vary that a little bit. It just depends on the photo. The point is, you got a lot of different options and a lot of control, which is really what masking is all about, to allow you to control the look of the mask and therefore control where the edit is going. Now, a couple of other things. If you need to see what I have as a pink overlay, you can click on the Show Overlay, and it's going to show you. That's representing what the mask looks like. Now, if your color isn't pink, you see this little square here. You can click on that, and you can pick any color you want. I use pink because it doesn't show up very often in any of my photos or anywhere else. Whereas I used to use red, but then I have things that are red. Maybe there's a red car, maybe there's a red sign or whatever, and sometimes it might be hard to see red. This color doesn't occur very naturally in any photos that I have, so it's a good overlay color because it's instantly visible. So you can change that there if you'd like to. And you've got this drop-down menu. You've got a lot of different options. Again, I won't go through all of that, but each mask is selectable and re-editable. So I can use mask and mask and mask again. I just keep adding plus to add more masks. And then if I ever need to delete them, I can just come in here and say delete mask 1, or if I'd saved the other ones, I could just say delete all masks, and it just basically takes me back to a blank photo. Okay, so now that we've done that, I'm going to go ahead and grab this photo, and I'm going to highlight it. I'm going to hit D to go into the develop section. And I've already done some basic adjustments on this photo. If you look at the before and the after, you can see that, and they were all done here in basic panel. And of course, they're all global, meaning everything I did applied across the entire photo. Well, I don't want that. As I said, I want a few things that need to be customized or specific. That's where masking comes in. So I'll start with brush. And there's a couple of things to be aware of. We covered size, feather, flow, and density, but there's this really important little tick box here. It says auto mask. Auto mask is going to look for those edges and detect them and keep your brush from painting over those edges. Now, it doesn't always get it perfectly, but it does a really good job, so it saves you quite a bit of pain. So I can come in here and I'm painting, and as I get around these edges, you can see it's pretty much lining that edge pretty well. And so I can come over here. Now, the edge is not as defined here along the bottom by the water, so you can see that that's not quite as clear there. But I also want to point out another thing, and that is it looks like it missed a couple of spots, and that's because auto mask is ticked. So it's looking for those edges everywhere, even inside this rock that I'm trying to paint on. So you can just turn that off. And by the way, you can also use the A key, A as in apple or auto. Every time you hit A, it'll turn it on or off. So it's on, I hit A, it turns it off. When I turn it off, I can just paint in here with reckless abandon, but remember, it's also not detecting edges anymore. So oops, I just went over that. So let's hit A so that we have that back on. And this is a good place to show you the erase. Click the erase function, and I want to come over here and clean that up. And that looks a little bit better, but I need a smaller brush. So left bracket key, and I'm going to get back to painting. I'm going to click back on that A, and I'm going to come over here, and because I have auto mask on, it's picking up those edges again. Now, you can get the rest of the rocks, and I would recommend doing that in an edit, but let's say I wanted to isolate that rock and bring up the exposure. You can see I'm doing that now. This exposure increase is only happening on that rock, and maybe I want to add some clarity too. That rock looks a lot better, and in fairness, I need to clean that up around that edge, and in reality, I need to mask the rest of the rocks. But I wanted to point out auto mask because it's super important for getting around those edges and keeping you kind of coloring within the lines, if you will. But when you're doing a big section like this where you just need to cover all of it, you may want to turn that off because it's looking for those edges and sometimes it will not fully cover that entire area when auto mask is on. I'm going to delete that, delete mask 1, and what I want to do now is show you a linear gradient. And this is an example where I would use a linear gradient on a landscape all the time for foregrounds because what I want to do is just kind of frame this image a little bit. And to be fair, this image we're not going to do a full edit here. This is just practice. And if you downloaded the file and join my newsletter, awesome, thank you. I send out tips and tricks every week, so feel free to check those out. But if you have this file and are following along, just play with this to your heart's content. Make it look the way you want. This can run down and basically hang off the page, so just be aware. I like that large, broad, if you will, gradient zone. And all I want to do is just drop the exposure a little bit to kind of frame my image. I don't really care about that little corner over there. I care about the rock and the sunset that's happening behind it. That's how I would use the linear gradient. So this is where I start stacking masks. I did a linear gradient. I'm going to add another mask, and you just click that plus sign. This time I'm going to get a radial gradient. So I'm going to walk through an example of each of the masks that I talked about earlier. So radial gradient, again, kind of a semicircular or oval figure, and you can just move your mouse around to kind of adjust the size and shape and that sort of thing. But just keep in mind, sometimes it's going to bleed over whatever you might have. That's where I think feathering comes in. If you go like this, you can see with the overlay, it's a hard edge. It's really going to come off those rocks. Whereas with feathering, it's going to be a whole lot less noticeable. So if I lift the exposure here, you can see it's going to lift the exposure more heavily in the middle because my feathering's at 100 and much less around the edge. So even though I went over the edge a little bit up here, it's not quite as noticeable. And so that's how I use radial masks to go target areas. In reality, I would make this smaller and a little bit more condensed, and I'd probably drop the feathering so that I would pick up some brightness in more parts of the rock. And 2.39 is way too bright. I'm doing it just so it's visible here. But in reality, I'd probably do something like maybe one stop or something, maybe not even that. Maybe 1.2 looks pretty good. And then you can come down here. This looks very similar to basic because it's essentially a replica of that. But you've got clarity, and if you add a little bit of clarity, it gives it a little bit of punch, a little bit of texture. It also brightens it a little bit. So now my rock's looking a little bit better. So that's a way to use radial gradients, and I use those all the time. It's a super powerful and popular way to do things. But in this case, there's another masking type that I'm going to demo that's actually better. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that. Remember the 3 dots right here, that's for the mask that you're on, right? So I can click the eyeball and that turns off, and then I can click the eyeball again, it turns it back on, but I want to delete that. So I'm going to click those 3. I can name them if I want to. I'm going to go ahead and delete mask 2. I don't want to delete all masks. I want to leave that first one down there. So, whoops, I just hit delete all masks. I didn't mean to do that. Control Z, it's going to bring that back for me on a Mac, and there's probably a Command Z or something on Windows. I didn't mean to delete them both. I meant to just delete mask 2. There we go. It's sometimes it's hard. You're talking to the video and you're doing things, and your brain and your fingers, they don't always, mine don't always stay in sync. But anyway, so we've done that. We're going to create a new mask. So plus, I'm going to click select subject. Sometimes it'll identify the subject in a photo, and it did a great job. Now, this subject mask is often used for portraits because it's a clear subject, but in this case, in a landscape, still a pretty clear subject, and perhaps more importantly, a pretty darn good mask if you look at it. I mean, it covered haystack rock and some of the other stuff over to the side, and it's in that lovely pink, so I can see it really easily. Now I can lift that exposure, kind of bringing that to life. I can lift the clarity, kind of bringing that to life, and hey, I've got a pretty good selection there, and all I did is click a couple buttons. And that's what I mean. It's so powerful and so easy, and frankly, I just kind of love it. So that's an example of how you can use a subject mask. And again, if you're done with it, you can just come over here and click Delete Mask 2. But that was a subject mask that allowed me to quickly and easily identify the entire subject of this photo. It doesn't work in every landscape. I think of it more like a portrait kind of tool. But in this landscape, it works incredibly well because it's basically blurred out water and blurred out sky from a long exposure and then a hard rock. It seemed kind of obvious that Lightroom would just pick that up, and it worked great. I'm going to go ahead and delete that, and we're going to open another mask, and this time we're going to try an object mask. So let me do that. Now this gives you a paintbrush, and you just come over here and you can paint roughly over Haystack Rock and say, I want this object to be masked, and you give it a second and it calculates, and it's using, I'm sure, the same intelligence as the subject mask, but I had to paint it myself. That's probably more useful in landscapes because it's not often going to be so easy for the subject mask to find what you're looking for. But in this case, object mask did a great job. And then I can go do the same thing. Hey, I want to lift the exposure a little bit so I can brighten up those rocks. Hey, I want to add a little clarity so it gets a little bit more crisp, a little bit more appearance of detail. And there we go. This time the object mask worked just as well as the subject mask, although it took a little bit more work. The subject mask, it kind of found it instantaneously, but again, it's a little bit more rare for that to work in a landscape in my experience, but of course it is going to depend on the photo. Once again, I'm going to delete this mask to give you another example. So plus to add a new mask, and this time I'm going to select background. And again, this doesn't always work perfectly, but in this case, it found everything but the rocks. But here's a fun little trick, right? So what I want to do is mask those rocks. I found everything except for the rocks by using a background mask. Well, that's where these three dots and some of these other options come in super handy. So click those three dots, and you can see it says duplicate and invert mask, right? Or you can just invert mask. I want to invert the mask because really what I want is just the rocks. So I'm going to go ahead and click that, and I've just got a perfect selection. Again, super intelligent. And once again, I'm going to do the same thing. I can just come in and say, all right, I want to increase the exposure, increase the clarity. But this time it was a background mask, and I found the background, or I should say Lightroom, found the background, did an incredible bang-up job finding everything but what I wanted, but just a quick invert in that three-dot menu, and inverting it, I now have essentially the same perfect mask that I had with object and subject selection. So in other words, the old expression, there's more than one way to skin a cat, very true in Lightroom masking. There are so many different ways that you can find different aspects of the photo and different masking tools to help you identify them, isolate them, and edit them. Now there's many other things that you can do, including if you click on the mask, right? It looked like this. There's technically a drop down. Any of these masks, if you click on them, there's a drop down and you can add or subtract. And this is where you can customize the mask even further. So I'm going to go back to this mask 2, and I'm going to go ahead and click subtract, and I'm going to say subtract with the brush. And in this case, let's say I want to take that rock out of it and maybe these rocks. For some reason, and this is just me making it up, for some reason I don't want those rocks. I just wanted the big rock. I've now adjusted the mask and erased those from it by adding or subtracting, in this case subtracting with the brush. So if I show you the overlay, that's what was identified. And you can see here, there's a little brush with a minus next to it that indicates this was erased, and you can also see that up here. And then if you want to come back in here and say, hey, I don't really want that, I can just delete brush 1, and I still have my background mask in place, and all my edits still apply as they initially did. Now remember, I showed you the duplicate and invert in this mask, right? Where I first went in and I identified the background, but I said, oh, I don't want to do that. I came over to this menu and I ended up selecting invert so I could just have the rocks. But you can also duplicate and invert, which is super helpful because now let's say I want to go apply some color to the sky and water. Well, I can duplicate and invert the mask. So it's going to create another mask, but it's going to be the opposite of this one, which is actually going to be the same as this original mask, which was just the background, if that makes sense. So now I've got everything selected except the rocks, and I could come in here and say, all right, maybe a slightly darker, maybe slightly cooler. I don't know, I'm making it up here. I don't really have a big plan for this, but maybe not darker. Maybe I'll just go a little bit brighter, but maybe I want to put on the highlights a little bit. The bottom line is I can come in and select everything but the rocks by just inverting this mask or making a copy and then inverting this mask. So if I turn this off, you can see the before, And after, I'm really able really quickly and powerfully to have that entire rest of the scene get an edit done to it without having to go create more masks. I'm just copying a mask I already have and making an invert of it. And then the last mask I want to show is the sky mask, which honestly, it does an incredibly good job. You just click select sky and you'll find that it finds a really isolates that sky quite well. And you can see it goes around the rocks. And you saw me earlier, I can click here and click subtract. If I want to clean up this little bit here that's in the water, it looks like a tiny bit there and a tiny bit over there. I'm not going to do that in this video, but let's say I wanted to brighten the sky just a tiny bit, and maybe I decide I kind of want it a little bit warmer but a little bit more tint, and I'm playing off some of that against the maybe cooler water because the water is shallow with sand, so it's going to be a little darker anyway. Obviously the light source is in the sky, so maybe I wanted a slightly different edit than what I did here, where in this case, I was editing the sky and the water together, and now I went in and customized a little bit more just for the sky. And by the way, you will see these little tick marks here that indicate what mask type was applied in different areas. So that just gives you a good visual representation. But now you can see if you look at the sky before and after, there's a slight difference in color based on what I did down here with the temperature tint. And I guess I didn't do any saturation, but let's say we want to make that a little bit more saturated. You can do that quite easily, just dragging the slider. So that, my friends, is the power of masking in Lightroom. It's super fun. I think you can understand why I say it's the ultimate editing skill, because when you learn how to use masks, you get incredible, amazing, fantastic, just unbelievable control over your image, and your image edits, and your results get so much better. And that's what happened for me years ago as I started learning masking, because in the beginning, I was honestly afraid of it. But once you start learning it and getting your arms around it, it's honestly not that hard. And all the tools that are in Lightroom, they're intelligent and they're easy, honestly. So you can skyrocket your results pretty quickly without a lot of effort, just learning how to use the masking tools. Hope this video helps. Thanks for watching. I'll be back soon with another one. You guys take care, and until next time, adios.